My name is Simone Nizell. Again, I'm the education coordinator at Del Oro, and I'm so pleased that you could join us today. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Nancy Wakefield, who is the Director of Care Services at the ALS Association's Greater Sacramento chapter. She will be presenting today on ALS, symptoms, diagnosis, kind of giving us a sense of what this disease looks like, both from the perspective of someone who receives a diagnosis and from that of the caregiver, and then offering some resources as well. We're so glad you could be here today. Please stick with us through the presentation. Again, we invite your questions. We ask you to use the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nancy Wakefield.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to do this presentation today. I'm always happy to get out into the community, obviously a little bit differently right now, but I'm always happy to get out and kind of spread some awareness about ALS. And this presentation, I think, is even that more important because caregiving can be such a difficult task for families and friends who have someone that they are caring for with ALS. There's a lot of there's a lot that's going on with someone with ALS, and most people, when they're faced with this diagnosis, really don't know anything about the disease. So I always am happy to get out and spread some of that information. I'm going to start with just letting you know that we're going to go through some slides here, and I will kind of give you a little bit of information about the pictures as well, because I just think it's always kind of nice to know what's going on in a picture instead of just looking at some faces and having no idea what that has to do with anything. So to begin with, as Simone said, I am the Director of Care Services with the ALS Association Greater Sacramento chapter. We are a small chapter, but we cover a large area of California. We cover 24 counties in Northern California. So we actually go all the way from the Oregon border down to San Joaquin County. Our chapter office is located here in Sacramento area, and actually in Citrus Heights to be exact. And I'm going to begin by just talking a little bit about what our association does. We do three main things. We do public policy, which means we go out and we advocate for people living with ALS and their families. We talk with our legislators in Washington, D.C., as well as here locally, about legislation that is important for people living with ALS. We also do fundraising, and our fundraising is for research as well as for direct care services, and which brings us to the third thing, which is our care services programs and services. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's where I come in. Promised I would tell you a little bit about the picture. This is a picture of one of our, we call them PALs, people with ALS. So we refer to our patients as PALs, and then caregivers of ALS are our CALs. So Nick is in this picture with one of his friends at, I believe this was an ALS walk event. And he always comes with a huge team of his friends and family supporting him. And Nick is from Lake Tahoe area. So we cover the South Lake Tahoe area as well.
Nancy,
Our mission is to discover treatments
Nancy,
and a
I'm
cure
sorry
for
to,
ALS. And while we do that, we're serving, advocating for, and empowering people affected by ALS to live their lives to the fullest. Our vision is a world without ALS. And here we have one of our board members, Heinz, who's on the left, is also a PALS, but he is on our board, has been on our board for quite a few years, and that's his wife, Betty. Okay, so what is ALS? ALS, or Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis, is a fatal neurodegenerative disease in which the brain actually loses the ability to communicate with the muscles. So what happens is the muscles slowly start to atrophy due to non-use. So a person will lose their ability to walk, to talk, to eat, and eventually to breathe, as it affects all the major muscles in the body. What happens initially is that someone may notice, depending on where it starts. So let's say it's a limb onset. Maybe it starts with one of the feet. They may notice that they're tripping, and for no apparent reason. We get a lot of people who are pretty active, and they might notice that when they are out running, they're having trouble lifting a foot. If it starts in a hand, you might see someone who is dropping things a lot. Not only dropping things, but then may start to have problems like with buttoning their shirt, or just picking up a pen. It's hard to keep the pen in their hand while they write. If you have someone who maybe has a bulbar onset, so that would be the upper motor skills, so that they may start to sound, their speech will start to sound slurred. Sometimes people think that the person's been drinking too much, because that's what it sounds like. Or they just will lose the ability to project their voice. So suddenly it just gets hard for them to speak loud enough to be heard. And actually it takes a lot of energy for them to raise their voice loud enough to be heard. They may also start having trouble with swallowing. Bulbar onset tends to have a shorter lifespan than a limb onset, because it does reach the the respiratory area sooner normally. And there are some kind of generalizations that we make based on what's seen, but not everybody progresses in the exact same way. So when I say that someone with bulbar onset ALS may not live as long as someone with a limb onset, that's not true for everyone. But generally, that is what we see. At this point, there's no cure for ALS. There are really no significant treatments. There are a couple of drugs that have been approved, and we'll talk about those here in a second. But no significant drugs that really halt the progression of this disease. And just some facts about ALS. About 5,000 people are diagnosed per year. The lifespan is on average 2 to 5 years. So every 90 minutes, someone is diagnosed and someone passes away from ALS. I know it's not a very well-known disease, although since the Ice Bucket Challenge, I think it's become much more common for people to know what we're talking about when we mention it. Part of the reason too that not a lot of people know about this disease is because it is a terminal disease, and people tend to pass away pretty quickly from the disease. So thus you don't have as many people living with it at any given time. Less than 10% of ALS cases are actually inherited through a mutated gene. It's a small percentage, but this group is very important in research, and a lot of the research that has been done and is being done is with people who have ALS in their family. And that's the way they're identifying mutations, gene mutations. There are many different gene mutations that then may cause ALS. But over 90% of cases are sporadic, meaning that they occur in people who don't have any family history of ALS. So we talked a little bit about what's happening. So what are those symptoms? We discussed muscle weakness, especially in arms and legs, speech, swallowing, breathing. What happens also is as the muscles atrophy, the limbs begin to look thinner. And actually, that is one of the issues that many of our ALS, our pals, are dealing with, is just being able to keep the weight on. Their muscles are working twice as hard as ours, just sitting there doing nothing. They can burn a lot more calories than if we're out walking, running around. And so it's really hard for them to keep weight on. And unfortunately, as they lose weight, it can speed up the progression of their symptoms. So it's really important, if you're caring for someone with ALS, that you are aware of the fact that they're going to need more calories. And it can become more difficult to get those calories if you have someone who's having bulbar symptoms and they're having a hard time swallowing and maybe are choking. So then you have to get a bit more creative in terms of how they're going to get their calories in. So making, high calorie shakes, things like that is usually what happens. Many of our patients who are having bulbar symptoms will get a feeding tube, and they may still be eating by mouth but can't get enough calories, so then they have to get additional calories through a feeding tube. Sometimes they get to the point where they actually cannot eat anything by mouth anymore, and so all the calories come through a feeding tube. Not everybody chooses a feeding tube, but I would say most will if needed. You might also notice in someone with ALS that they have a lot of muscle twitching or fasciculation. Some people, it's really so pronounced that as you sit there and talk with them, you can see their muscles jumping around on their arms or legs. Again, these are the muscles actually dying, and that's part of what happens in that process. I mentioned the thick speech, difficulty projecting the voice. And then in more advanced stages, you will notice a shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, and swallowing. So although some people may have what's referred to as thick speech, some other people will have speech problems that sound a little bit different, in that it's halting voice, like I said, inability to project, and that usually is due more because of a shortness of breath. So they have to be catching their breath constantly as they're talking, and they can become very fatigued just trying to have a conversation with someone. Oh, in this picture, this is Nate, and Nate was one of our younger pals. He passed away just at the end of this previous year in December. And he actually was involved in a documentary, which some of you may have seen, called Beyond the Ice Bucket, that has been on PBS several times. And then in the smaller picture is our pals, Erica. Oops, no, you can't see the smaller picture. I'm sorry, I'm seeing the screen ahead of me, and I forgot that you don't see that one, but there it is. This is Erica and her daughter, Denise. So how is ALS diagnosed? At this point, there is no known test that can identify ALS. So again, this is the other important reason for research. And the research that's being done is being done for all different things, not just to find a cure, but also to be able to come up with a test that accurately identifies ALS. Currently, there are people who sometimes have to wait years before they get a diagnosis. Meanwhile, they may be misdiagnosed several times. They may have to endure surgeries if they are misdiagnosed. I've known many people who have had back surgeries or carpal tunnel surgeries because of misdiagnosis. So research is looking into, yes, cures, but also coming up with tests, treatments to slow down the progression, to halt the progression. There are clinical trials just to deal with some of the symptoms that come with ALS. Thousands of different clinical trials that happen all over the world. Let's see, so when somebody starts to show symptoms and they go into their doctor, one of the reasons that it can take years before you get a diagnosis has to do with the fact that they may not get to the right kind of doctor right away. So if you are seeing a primary care physician who maybe hasn't seen anyone with ALS, they may not notice some of the symptoms that would then possibly get them to refer that patient to a neurologist. And even if they get to a neurologist, again, there are many neurologists who have never had experience with ALS. So unless they have seen this before, they may not think immediately about this disease and get them to the right place for a diagnosis. There are many neurodegenerative diseases that mimic ALS, and the process of diagnosing is really a process of ruling out all of these other diseases until you are left with ALS. And as part of this, a patient will have to go through an EMG, a nerve conduction velocity test, blood and urine samples, spinal taps, MRIs, biopsies, all kinds of tests that will hopefully finally, as quickly as possible, get them a diagnosis. Once they receive that diagnosis, then actually, let me go back here because I want to mention this for sure. Once they receive that diagnosis, hopefully wherever they're getting the diagnosis will know to refer them over to a specialized clinic for ALS, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But not only get them to the right medical clinic, but also hopefully refer them over to our chapter, to whatever chapter covers the area they live in, so that they can learn about the services and resources that are available to them. So who's at risk of getting ALS? We tend to see ALS, diagnosed mainly with older people, but not just with older people. If you kind of look at a bell curve, the 60s will be at the top of the bell curve, but we have patients who are diagnosed in their 20s. There have been patients diagnosed in their teens. Our chapter has even seen patients in their teens and 20s. And then, of course, we've had patients, well into their 90s. But usually it's somewhere in, between the 40s to 60s, where most of our patients are in that age range. Both men and women get diagnosed. Men are diagnosed more often than women with ALS, kind of 60 to 40%. Every time I run the statistics, it's always right about 60% men, 40% women. There is a military connection in that about 20% of our caseload is at all times military. The military have more than twice the chance of getting ALS than non-military people. Because of this, the Veterans Association is a big part of, or a huge partner for us. We always get all of our veterans connected with the VA because there are benefits and services for them through the VA that will become very important in the progression of their disease. The Department of Defense also provides a lot of funding for research because of this military connection. But overall, I mean, anyone can really get ALS. As I mentioned previously, over 90% of cases are sporadic, meaning there's no connection. You don't know why the person got ALS. In this picture, we have, so Kelly is our, one of our pals as well. And she, in this picture, she and her husband are at one of our walks to defeat ALS. She also has a huge group that gets together for the walk and supports her through a team. All right. Available treatments. I mentioned that there's no cure at this time and that there are a couple of treatments with small significance really in slowing down the progression of ALS. And those two drugs are Rilotec and Radicava. Rilotec has been around for several years. It's taken in a pill form. Radicava is a bit newer, and that one is an infusion. So the patient must get a port and then goes in for infusions on a regular basis. Both of these drugs slow down the progression, or are thought to slow down the progression of ALS. At most, probably just around 3 to 4 months. So not a significant slowing down of the disease, but that is what we have at this point. The one, sorry, I wasn't done with that one yet. Let me go back. The one thing that has shown to have a significant results in a significant slowing down of progression is a multidisciplinary care. And I think I mentioned before that hopefully once somebody is diagnosed, they quickly are referred over to specialized ALS care. And I was referring to our multidisciplinary care. There are clinics throughout the U.S. that specialize in ALS. These multidisciplinary care clinics are made up of a group, each is made up of a group of specialists that deal with the different symptoms of ALS. So you would have a neurologist, a speech therapist, a nutritionist, a physical therapist, a respiratory therapist, a social worker, possibly a psychologist. All of these people are part of a team, and they see ALS patients on an ongoing basis together. So a patient will come in for an appointment and is seen by all of those disciplines at that one appointment. Makes a huge difference. It means the patient isn't having to go to multiple appointments on different days, different places, and possibly seeing people who really don't specialize in ALS. If a patient is part of one of these clinics, they know that they are being seen by people who specialize in ALS. And it has shown in research to significantly slow down the progression of the disease. So we are always recommending, as soon as we see somebody in our chapter, we recommend that they get into one of the clinics as soon as possible if they aren't already in one. And here in the Sacramento area, we're fortunate to be a part of 3 of the clinics, or 3 clinics here are the UC Davis Multidisciplinary ALS Clinic. There's a Forbes Norris ALS Clinic that is actually based in San Francisco, but we bring them to Sacramento once a month so that they are able to see patients here, and patients don't need to travel all the way to San Francisco to be seen. The appointments can be, a couple to several hours long, and having to go all the way to San Francisco sometimes just isn't doable for patients, especially as they advance. There is also a multidisciplinary clinic that is part of Kaiser here in Sacramento. And those are the 3 clinics that our chapter partners with, and we play a role in that ALS, with that ALS team. Okay, what is it that we do? As I mentioned, there are chapters throughout the US, and each chapter may look a little bit different. They're run separately. They have different programs and resources. So here at the Greater Sacramento chapter, as I mentioned, we cover 24 counties, and all of the services that we provide are free of charge. So we will never charge a patient for any of our services. And let's move forward. But before we move forward, I wanted to mention that this is Shelley in the wheelchair with her walk team. Shelley is a veteran, and she too is on our board of directors. Okay, this is how we are able to help our pals and our CALs and their families and friends through our services and our programs. We have support groups. Currently, we have 6 different support groups covering the 24 counties that we serve. Obviously, with COVID, our support groups have had to go online, but we are still holding support groups. In fact, the fact that we've gone online has helped some of our pals be able to access support groups. They may have not been able to do so before, either because they weren't able to leave their home, or maybe the closest support group wasn't very convenient to them. Now, all of the groups are online, so anyone can join in no matter where they live. We will continue to offer online support groups. Even after our groups go in person, we will still continue to offer the online option. One of our most popular programs is our equipment loan program, and we are able to loan out pretty much any type of equipment that an ALS patient might need, again, free of charge. And this is necessary when you have a patient who maybe doesn't have insurance, or maybe isn't able to afford their copay. A power wheelchair can cost up to almost $50,000. So you can imagine if you have a significant copay that it might be difficult to cover that cost. There are some insurance plans that don't cover durable medical equipment. So any of the equipment that they end up needing would not be covered. So in those cases, we are able to provide equipment through our loan program. And also, equipment can take a while, even if it is covered through insurance, it can take a while to get that approval and then have the equipment ordered and delivered. So a lot of times we're just kind of covering that gap of the patient needs the equipment now, it's not going to be there for a while, so we're able to cover that period of time so that they're not having to go without. We do community outreach. We present at different organizations, whether it's, Del Oro, as we're doing today, or home care agencies, or fairs, wherever. Sometimes it's an employer who has had somebody diagnosed and they would like us to come and speak. We are out there and we're able to do that whenever we're asked. As I mentioned, we are part of the multidisciplinary clinical care teams at the 3 clinics. We offer grants. Currently, we have grants for assistance with home care. We have grants for medical transportation and also for durable medical equipment. So if there's something that we can't provide, or maybe it's a repair, we have grants for that as well. We do patient advocacy. I mentioned at the beginning, we have a whole advocacy program where we go out and meet with our representatives to make sure that all of our ALS patient needs are front and center. We do home evaluations. That has been a video evaluation program in the last year plus, or a little over a year, but we are able to help people kind of plan for mobility in their home or equipment in their home, care, all those kinds of things. And then I think, most importantly, we're there to help them throughout the progression of the disease, whether it be with information, with needed referrals, or just to know what those resources are that are available to them in the community. We're there every step of the way to help with all those things, hopefully save them time, get them the right resources, and in many cases, save them a lot of money. And how do we do this? We do this through our fundraising, which is done through special events, through our Walk to Defeat ALS, which is our biggest event. This year we did a NorCal 90 challenge. Some of you may have heard about it. We also do a gala event. And there are a lot of organizations and people who will do third-party events. That's how we do our fundraising that pays for all the services so that we don't have to charge our patients. If you're interested in knowing what you can do, here are some ways. You can always volunteer. You can volunteer for special events. You can become an ALS advocate. You can obviously always donate. There are many ways to help with the fight against ALS. And I want to make sure that you know that we are here to answer any questions. We're going to have a little time here so that you can ask any questions that you may have. But I also want you to know that you can reach out to me. There is my contact information. You can always reach out to me if you have questions, if you know someone who has ALS, even if you need information about how someone goes about getting, being seen if they have some symptoms that they're concerned about. That's my contact information. You can call our number. Actually, anyone who answers can help you. My extension is extension 1. You don't have to remember that. We're a small office, and anyone can always help you. So I wanted to now kind of turn it back over to Simone and see if we have any questions that I can answer.
You have a couple of questions, and I posted in the chat for those of you who may have questions and haven't yet asked them. Please send those over to me or post them in the chat to everyone either way, so we can get them answered. But the first question is kind of as a clarification. You said that there are some neurodegenerative diseases that mimic ALS. What are those diseases, and which are the most commonly mistaken, or which diseases most commonly mirror or mimic ALS?
Wow, well, there are so many that I would not be able to list them all for you. But commonly we'll see, people who have, like, MS is one that has a lot of the symptoms, or, that share a lot of the same symptoms. There are all kinds of atrophies that may mimic the disease. There are some diseases that may kind of be precursors. It's usually, if I can't really name any common ones that are usually misdiagnosed. There are hundreds of neuromuscular diseases, and so it could be any one of those. Often it's not even any of those. Often you'll see, and I think I mentioned it at the beginning, people will be misdiagnosed and told that they have some kind of a back issue, or they have some kind of a nerve issue. It's not always a neuromuscular disease that they get. It can be, they'll think it's from an injury. One interesting thing is we tend to see a lot of people who have been very active, physically active in their lives. So I've had many, marathon runners, triathletes, skiers, and a lot of times at first it's thought to be things associated with past injuries. So it just is kind of all over the place. It really depends on who they end up being seen by in some cases.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it sounds like there's more research that needs to be done, kind of identifying.
Yeah, and a lot of research is focused on just getting biomarkers so that we can have some kind of test, and it's not, years of just trying to guess what's going on.
You mentioned that before, and we had another question about that. You said that there's no known test to diagnose ALS. It's kind of a process of elimination. Is there any hope on the horizon that there will be a diagnostic test available?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's hope not only for that, but hope for a cure within our lifetime. And, I always say I am looking for that cure while I'm still here at the ALS Association. But yes, that is definitely a big area of research. And, you know, if anything, I think that that will be the first thing that we get, and, you know, followed with diseases that actually halt the progression, you know, followed with a cure.
Great, thank you. We also have a question about the military connection. So is there any information about why there's a connection between a greater incidence of ALS among veterans?
Well, again, unfortunately, we don't know a lot about that. There are, you know, there's research looking into whether this has something to do with exposure. Is it, you know, something that the military is exposed to much more than, you know, the average person? And is that an environmental exposure? Is that a, you know, there are just so many different areas that they are looking at in terms of what is it that what kind of stressors do the military go through that are different than those of us who have not been in the military, and how are those stressors able to affect the body? There really is little known about why ALS affects people. The Centers for Disease Control has a registry, an ALS registry, where anyone who is diagnosed with ALS can go on, register themselves as someone with ALS, and then they are sent surveys that they fill out. And these surveys are asking questions about anything having to do with their life. Where were you born? Where have you lived? What kind of water did you drink growing up? You know, where have you traveled in your lifetime? What kind of work have you done? All of this information is being gathered through this registry, and it's available to researchers so that they can look for commonalities. And then, you know, when those commonalities are identified, researchers are able to then kind of focus their efforts and dollars towards researching that area.
Great, thank you. That registry sounds like an excellent resource as well. Is that available on the ALS Association's website?
It is, and if anyone with ALS is interested in that, I can definitely help them, but it is on our website, and we encourage anyone with a diagnosis to register.
Wonderful. Well, Nancy, those are all of the questions that we had thus far. Thank you again for this information and for your contact information. I'm so pleased that we were able to come together to bring this presentation to our clients and to our community. I want to take a moment now as we wrap up today's program to talk a little bit about Del Oro Caregiver Resource Center. So I'm going to stop the recording